Okay, great. So, hi again. I'm Regina from EWPN. Thanks so much for joining us. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, EWPN is the first and only pan European community for women in cards, fintech, and payments. You can also learn more about us and our events at ewpn.eu. We'll be taking questions at the end of our fireside chat, but feel free to add your questions and comments into the chat section. Joining us today is Catherine Tong, our EWPN UK country ambassador, and she's currently a partner at Allies. She has over 20 years of experience in risk and fraud management across multiple industries, including retail, airlines, travel, digital gaming, financial services, and probably a whole lot more. So welcome, Catherine. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you, Regina. Good to be able to join you.
Thanks. I thought we would just maybe start off the session just by maybe chatting a little bit about you and getting to know you a little bit more. Would you mind maybe sharing a little bit about yourself? Why fintech? Why risk and fraud?
Sure. Yeah, no problem at all. I guess like many people that are in the risk or even in fintech, I wouldn't say it was something that I had an ambition to do from an early age. Kind of stumbled across it and found it really interesting, and I got the bug. It's probably how I'd describe it. So I first started working in risk and fraud when I left university. I joined PwC in their risk audit and risk function before then focusing more on the fraud area. And at that time, it was when lots of big accounting frauds were happening. So Enron, WorldCom, Xerox, lots of things that were hitting the headlines. And I always found it fascinating to know what was really going on in the background after reading what was in the headlines. So definitely helped to get that interest going. But then I had the opportunity to move to Tesco, and I started at Tesco in their audit function before moving into e-commerce fraud. Okay. And with the e-commerce fraud, actually that was kind of by mistake, because somebody said to me, we've got a bit of a fraud problem. Could you work on this for 3 months and help us fix it? And 5 years later, I was still doing the same role. So either took a very long time to fix the problem, or it was a much bigger issue than I think any of us appreciated in those early days. And since then, I've had the privilege to work with lots of other retailers, as you said, travel merchants, gaming, when I was working at a Certify, so seeing a much broader set of e-commerce fraud issues. And then more recently at Allies, where I'm one of the co-founding partners. Again, we see from a vendor perspective, merchant perspective, card scheme perspective, all different types of fraud and all different kinds of ways that people are trying to find ways to defraud or maybe exploit policies that the different merchants have.
That's great. And how long have you been there now?
So just over 2 years. I've been with Allies.
That's awesome. And you've also been, along the same time, our UK country ambassador for a little while now. And as everyone knows, at EWPN, our mission is to really champion for more diversity, equity, and inclusion in the fintech industry. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience and what you've been doing to support DEI?
Yeah, so when I joined EWPN, I came to a few different events that were hosted in London. Some of them were just social. Some of them had a bit more of a learning opportunity as well. And it was a great way to meet people more broadly across the fintech industry, certainly from my perspective, not just e-com. And what I found really interesting was the breadth of people that were in those sessions. So some people who were relatively new graduates, so very young, very early in their careers, and wanted to learn and experience more of what was going on in the broader industry. But then also people who'd maybe been in the industry 20, 30 years and wanted to share some of their experiences and, keep connected with this kind of community. And so when I joined as one of the ambassadors for the UK, we definitely wanted to keep that momentum going. Right. It's unfortunate in some ways because I joined as an ambassador in October 2019. Right. And we had 2 events. One in December and then one in February, and then of course lockdown happened. Right. So last February was the last in-person event that we were able to hold. I guess it's fortunate that it was so close to the lockdown that it was as close as we could make it. But what's been interesting for me is how it's kind of moved into more of a one-to-one relationship with people. So whether it's with ex-colleagues that I've continued to support and help, whether from a career perspective, or whether to help them meet or get to know people who are going through similar maybe challenges or at a similar stage in their careers, and they want a peer to talk with and to share that with and to use as a bit of a sounding board. So sometimes I've felt like a bit of a networking hub, kind of, well, you might want to talk to and help people to get to know each other that way, as well as sharing some of my specific experiences, whether from a career development, how to balance work life, and actually from my perspective, helping people to adjust to working remotely, because I know it's not for everybody, but it's something that I've done for almost 10 years now, and I absolutely love it. So helping people to or share kind of my experiences of what's worked, what hasn't worked for me has been useful as well.
That's great. And so it's interesting, if we were to move a little bit into the topic at hand, not only was there a lot going on in everybody's lives during the lockdown, but just even in payments and fintech and anything that had to do with business in general, 2020 was just a really big year, especially in the fraud world, because you had impacts coming in from the SCA, strong customer authentication, and then the pandemic really didn't help things as well. How were merchants getting prepared, or were they prepared for it? Because it came upon quite suddenly.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of did and it kind of didn't. So I certainly, if I think back 18 months, 2 years, even then there was a sense of SCA fatigue. People had already been preparing for a little while. Well, they fell into two camps, actually. Some had been preparing for a while, others were putting it off until they absolutely had to do something about it. And so when 2020 hit, many stakeholders weren't ready, and that included on the merchant side. And I think that happened in particular because merchants felt they had very little influence over how SCA worked for them. It's the issuers that make the final decision, not them. And so they almost had to wait to see what the issuers were going to do and how to react, to see what they had to do and mitigate any of the things that then had a knock-on consequence, if you like. And I think for large merchants especially, a lot of them did think ahead. They were in contact with issuers directly and trying to foresee things that they could or couldn't influence as SCA rolled out. But there was definitely then a distinction to the longer tail of small merchants, the majority of who realistically didn't really know what was coming or understand what was coming. And so as SCA slowly started to roll out across Europe, some have been taken by surprise. They've suddenly seen authorization rates drop. They've suddenly seen that their customers aren't able to shop as easily as they could before. But I think the other thing that's muddied the waters is there have been an awful lot of new entrants to e-commerce. So if I think of retail, for example, if you've been a physical retailer that's had shops for the last however many years, that wasn't really going to work over the last 18 months. And so almost some have had to be forced into to going digital. And for that group, they don't really know what to expect because they don't have a benchmark to assess against. They can't look at their history because they didn't have one. And so I think it's been really interesting how that's evolved. But what's really hard to unpick is what was as a result of SCA and what was as a result of the pandemic. And of course, neither of us, no one's going to know that. But hopefully in 2022, that will start to stabilise, and well, both SCA and COVID will start to stabilise, and we start to understand what things should look like and what the new benchmarks are.
Yeah. It just occurred to me, and I know we didn't really talk so much about this earlier, but is there a difference between smaller and larger merchants, or even merchants who are more local versus those who might be doing business across multiple regions? It must be so different because the rules are so different and quite complex, if you ask me. And I've been in fintech for some time, so not quite as experienced as you in your area, but certainly just it's complex to follow everything. So
absolutely. I mean, for small merchants, realistically, most aren't going to have someone that's focused on fraud and payments and therefore a specialist who really knows what's happening. They're really reliant on their third parties and their vendors and what they can do to help and support. So I think for those businesses, that's where there's kind of the biggest shock and the biggest reaction at the moment. but actually probably they don't know what they don't know, and
Yeah.
so maybe a little bit blind
Yeah.
to the current situation.
Yeah. So thinking a bit more about SCA then, to your point earlier, doesn't it mean now that fraud is no longer a merchant's problem, but instead a liability that shifts to the issuer?
Actually, it links back to the question you asked me just then,
Yeah.
Regina, because if you've got a merchant that's solely focused in Europe,
Yeah.
then yes, a lot of the liability will be shifted to issuers rather than sitting with the merchant.
Yeah.
But it still depends, because if it's a card that's not issued in Europe, then it's out of scope.
Yeah.
There are lots of exemptions. There are lots of things that are out of scope that mean that if any of the transactions that you're processing as a merchant fall into that category, then it is still your problem and your challenge. And what's interesting, adding on to that, is that because Europe is now a lot more regulated than the rest of the world, actually things like 3D Secure are starting to be implemented in other regions as well, as fraud started to migrate and be pushed, because actually merchants do like to have that sense of, it's not going to be my liability if this doesn't go so well, I can push that somewhere else. And it's also forced a lot of the vendors in the space to rethink how they approach the market, as well as people get more comfortable with I like liability shift. I'd much rather have some certainty, and if you're using a vendor, for example, maybe I pay a bit more, but it's worth it for me. But the other thing SCA doesn't address is anything that's non-payment fraud. So if it's something that's associated with account takeover, for example, or if you're looking at deliveries, and certainly more than 50% of merchants now are being reported as seeing fraud migrating to those different types. So actually, all you're doing is pushing it elsewhere rather than getting rid of it. But of course, it's very difficult to measure all those different areas to really know what the true impact is.
Right. So, like you said earlier, fraud is everywhere, right? And we see all the different players in the value chain in payments sort of taking steps to make things happen. I can just remember in all the different scheme rules from the Visas and the MasterCards and the American Expresses, you and I both chatted about earlier, just making many moves. So how do you think fraud will evolve, not even just, last year, but also now, and then to some degree in the future, right? So.
It kind of depends on how you define fraud. So when I've talked to different stakeholders in the industry about this, immediately a lot of people just associate fraud, certainly in the context I've been talking to people, as payment fraud. And so in Europe, yes, that's going down because SCA does become a barrier. It is an extra piece of information fraudsters need to have in order to have their transaction processed. But if you're looking at it more globally, then fraud is still growing. It is still going up. But actually, if you start to consider things like account takeover, loyalty fraud, some of the other areas that I mentioned just now, there have been some really steep increases. But this almost comes back to the point we were talking about in the first question. It kind of depends on whether the merchant's looking for those other types of fraud as to whether they realise it's happening. So for things like delivery fraud or refund fraud, if you're not looking at the data and seeing if it's happening, you might miss it. You might just see refunds are going up, but you might feel, well, that's because of the way customers are shopping with us now. They've changed their behaviours and their habits, rather than having a perspective of, well, actually, is it legitimate that all of these refunds are being issued? But I also think as well, because consumers are changing their behaviours and a lot of merchants are encouraging that behaviour change, that's also kind of muddying how fraud's evolving. So if, as an example, if you're shopping for clothes, you'll go into a shop in the physical world and you'll go and try them on and decide what you like and what you don't like. If you can't go into a shop, then the clothing retailers have had to shift more to a try before you buy type model. And so even more than you saw before the pandemic, people are buying multiple sizes, multiple colours because they're not quite sure, and then sending them back. But that also encourages things like wardrobing abuse. So I'm going to wear this dress once, I'm going to wear it out, and then I'm going to send it back. So you have actually worn it. You shouldn't be sending it back. But obviously with this kind of try before you buy type culture, it's becoming, people become increasingly aware it's possible and that they could still get a refund for it. And the other interesting evolutions I've seen as well, there's been a few documents published by fraudsters where they're selling their own IP. It's called refund as a service.
Yeah.
And they are literally, they've got a website, they've got manuals and booklets, and they'll charge maybe $500 or 500 euros. And you can read through that booklet and see how you can defraud various merchants in e-com and get a return for it. So merchants have really had to be aware of what's out there and what's going to be changing their customers' behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one of my next questions is, what can merchants do to combat all these changes? And I also think too, even as a customer, I'm seeing more and more fraud through text messages. People are somehow getting a hold of a WhatsApp number and just finding ways to send WhatsApp. It's more than the emails now. The links look, when you see them, they look like they could be real. And unless you're very careful, or maybe in my case a bit paranoid, right, you're not going to click on something immediately, right? So what can merchants do? Because it's a huge reputational issue as well, not just only all the work that they have to do behind the scenes to make sure it's safe.
It is, and specifically for what you've been describing, Regina, I have seen some merchants who are educating their customers a lot more. So saying, if you receive a text from us, or if you get asked to give your password or whatever it might be, don't do it, because we will never ask you for that. And it's great to see that kind of education. What's a bit challenging with that, though, as a consumer, you're probably only going to go and look at those help pages if you've already given that information across. And it's not really something a merchant wants to be plastering across the front page of their screen, because they're there to sell things to people, not to scare people that they might be defrauded. So that can be quite challenging. But in terms of what merchants can do to combat fraud, at a very baseline level, I don't think it's fundamentally changed. You need data, and you need to be monitoring that data, and you need to know what you're looking for, and be open to looking at changes and adjustments in trends in the data. In terms of what can really help with that, though, data is only as good as actions you can then take from it. And so reviewing the tools that you've got and that you're using to help combat fraud, and making sure, particularly as we just talked about, fraud's been evolving and changing. It's not just about payment fraud, it's now expanding to much wider areas. Make sure your tools are flexible enough to adjust to those different types of fraud, so that you're not then having to go and search for another partner or another solution to be able to address those. And I also think it's become a lot more important to build your allies internally. So to build internal partnerships. And if I stick with the examples I've shared here, looking at things like delivery fraud, for example, if you've partnered with your logistics team and help them to work with their couriers to understand what a good proof of delivery looks like when customers don't want to sign a piece of paper or a device in the current times, they don't want to have that contact. Well, what else can be done to make sure that your customer doesn't then claim, well, I never received my product? Certainly that's on the increase, but I don't think the courier companies have always got the best answer for that. I've seen some of them pushing the liability to customers, saying, well, if you don't want to sign a piece of paper, it's your problem if it goes missing. Not the best customer experience. But equally, the card scheme rules haven't been updated to say, well, if we don't have a signature as a proof of delivery, then this is a good alternative. So it's definitely an area where I would like to think that's going to evolve and change. But for now, it is definitely a big risk area for merchants, and they need to be looking at the ways they can mitigate that.
Right. Are there any best practices that you might be able to suggest for a merchant who they could be new to the industry, or maybe online is really scaling rapidly? It's both practices, as we've been talking about operation, but it's also all the changing rules. And again, when I think, we're in the industry, right? And we think there's a lot going on. I can't imagine for a merchant who's also trying to run a business, right? This is just one of many bazillions of issues that they're trying to deal with. So are there any things that you can suggest to them?
So I guess the first one is, make sure you've got KPIs so that you know what you're comfortable with from a fraud perspective, because fraud isn't going to go away. There will always be some kinds of fraud. And so knowing what an acceptable level is for your business and managing it around that is definitely a good starting point. partnering with your providers is incredibly helpful as well.
Yeah.
So if you've chosen well and you've got providers who can help share best practices specific to your industry and maybe specific to your region as well, because it can vary by region, they can be invaluable to help get a bit more of a broader industry perspective.
Yeah.
But I guess it's also about making sure that you yourself as an individual looking at these areas, that you've got a good balance, because one of the things that I have seen is obviously a lot of companies have gone through cost cutting over the last few months, unfortunately. And what that's driven across all business areas is a real focus on what's it costing me to use this service.
Right.
And I think we can all understand why and the rationale behind that. But in the fraud and payments world, that can be incredibly harmful, because if you're just looking for the cheapest solution, it can have a consequence on your sales.
Yeah.
So as an example, in payments, it could have a consequence on your authorization rate.
Yeah.
If you don't have a provider that's able to be flexible on how they route transactions and are able to process transactions, you could be turning away a huge percentage of your sales and your genuine customers. And the same is true in the fraud world.
Yeah.
If you've got a solution that's not flexible and that you can really tailor to pinpoint this is good and this is bad, you're going to turn away a lot of genuine customers. And particularly if you're a new business to e-com, that can be incredibly damaging to inhibit that those initial growth stages and building up your brand and reputation.
Right.
So I guess the other best practice would be, don't just focus on costs. Very tempting though it might be in the current climate, is to make sure you're focusing on your genuine customers and your sales, because I would hope for most businesses, that's 99% of your customers. You want to make sure that your providers are servicing them well. But of course, in this particular area, you still need to make sure those solutions are focusing on that 1% of bad traffic that you want to get rid of.
Yeah, absolutely. I always, not only do I feel for a lot of the merchants, it's such, there's so much admiration as well, because like we're saying, this is just one of many things that they're dealing with. Are there resources that perhaps maybe you could suggest? Maybe we could do this offline later on, and we can post this as well, that we might be able to suggest for people. So it's a start, right? For people as they think about, what to do to manage fraud and risk in their business. Perhaps we could do some of that offline, if that's okay.
Yeah, I've certainly got a list of webinars and conferences, albeit of course a lot of those are virtual at the moment, or different hashtags and things to follow. Then yes, certainly more than happy to share that detailed list. There are resources out there certainly for people to get started with.
Perfect. And so if I think about the future, then how will fraud evolve in the coming months? What's your crystal ball?
So I think from a fraud perspective, delivery fraud is going to continue to evolve, and unfortunately we're coming up to peak season for retailers at the moment, as we start getting to Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and then the Christmas and Thanksgiving trading period in the US. And so as people become aware that they can claim that they didn't deliver something and either get their money back or maybe a second product delivered to them, and particularly as a lot of economies are still struggling, it's an unfortunate reality that as economies struggle, you tend to have to see an increase in fraud, because people can't afford the things that they used to, and particularly when you're coming up to holiday season, are going to be maybe a little bit more tempted to find ways that they can still, whether it's live the lifestyle they want to, give the gifts that they used to be giving, then unfortunately people can turn to the dark side. So certainly one area I see is growing. The other that I think is interesting is around buy now, pay later. Definitely the buzzword of the moment. And there's plenty of activity. There is plenty of activity, whether it's the different methods that are available, whether it's from a business perspective, all the acquisitions that are happening. But it's definitely an area that consumers seem to be embracing and wanting more of. I'm certainly not going to give a perspective as to whether I think it's an appropriate payment method or not. But what it does give rise to is maybe not just fraud, but also credit-related issues. To how, as a business, do you assess whether somebody is likely to pay you or not? How do you assess if something is going to become bad debt? Because maybe someone genuinely did think that they could afford whatever it is they're purchasing, and then their circumstances change, which mean they can't. But on the flip side, because it's not a regulated industry
Yeah.
in most countries,
Yeah.
actually one of the challenges is some people don't know they're signing up to buy now, pay later when they're making a purchase.
Yeah.
It's not until they receive an email or when they look at the amount that they were actually charged on their card that they realise they've signed up to something they didn't intend to. And so I'd like to think that there's going to be a bit more clarity and regulation, whether it goes as far as applying for a loan or credit more generally. I'm not sure it would go quite that far, but there certainly needs to be a bit more clarity and visibility for customers, and also solving simple things like, well, what happens if you want a refund or if you want to dispute a transaction? It's a lot more complicated with buy now, pay later, because you've got a relationship with the merchant, with the buy now, pay later provider, and depending on how that's structured, it depends on who needs to interact with who to resolve those non-happy path payment methods, I think. And whenever that happens, of course, it's then open to fraud because you've got lots of people involved that maybe aren't quite joined up enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Just out of curiosity, do you see many differences in the way how merchants should approach thinking about fraud if they're coming from different industries? To some degree, EWPN is a little bit more focused on fintech, but US industry across so many different, or you've experienced across so many different industries. Any thoughts that come to mind on that?
It definitely varies, because if you are selling physical products that turn out to be fraud, not only do you have a reverse of a sale, but you've probably lost the product that you shipped to somebody as well. And looking at things from a margin perspective, you've probably got a much lower margin in retail than you would in something that's digital. So maybe a digital download, for example. There isn't a physical product that you've lost. You could shut down that service so that they're not, the fraudster isn't benefiting from it, but probably your margins are a lot higher. And all those things are important to determine, well, how precise do I need to be in my decisions? Because what does it actually mean to us as a business? I could probably have a bit more of a tolerance in a digital space than I would be able to in something that's got low margins in the physical space. So knowing what your tolerances are and what it means to your business, and what your return is for any investment you put into this area, those tend to be the most important factors.
That's great. And if we're sort of getting to the end before we move into the question and answer period. I guess if you were to leave maybe one or two really important points, are there some takeaways that you'd like the audience to know a little bit about for themselves or for merchants?
So I think what I would say is don't be fearful of fraud. So a few people that I've been working with over recent months have had big fraud attacks, and it's got them really scared. So like, how do we bring this under control? How can this suddenly have cost us so much as a business? And you do need to keep a cool head in that situation, because the worst thing that you can do is overreact and start rejecting a lot of your genuine customers, and then the problem becomes a lot bigger. So making sure that you've got ways to monitor your customer behavior, so you can maybe preempt that something's starting to happen before it does become too much of an issue, is definitely important. But then if it does, just don't overreact. Just monitor the data, look for the trends, reach out to experts, whether that's peers in the industry or whether that's people that you want to come and work with you in the business on a short or long-term basis. But also help your broader business to understand as well, not to be fearful, to help to educate your broader business, and that making sure you're doing little and often is much easier and much better than dealing with something once it's become a problem.
Right. And there are tools, right? So this isn't like manual monitoring that someone needs to go and look at every transaction or data that comes through, correct?
It tends to be a balance of the two, actually. So absolutely, there are tools that can automate the majority of it. And then you always need a little bit of a human touch just to make sure that what you think is happening is happening. And different companies have different views as to how much they want to automate. That tends to be based on business culture more than anything. But yes, a good fraud process should certainly be automating as much as possible, and not having a lot of manual intervention.
Right, right, right. Well, thanks so much. And how can people get in touch with you, either about EWPN or to learn more about this area and topic? I noticed that you put your email into the chat as well. Are there other ways that people get a hold of you if they don't copy the email
Yeah,
down?
so either catherine@allies.com, or please feel free to contact me through LinkedIn as well. I certainly keep an eye on that account on a regular basis. Happy for people to reach out either way, as you say, either from an EWPN perspective or from a risk and fraud perspective.
Great. Thank you for that. And I'd love to open it up now to questions. We've got a relatively smaller and more intimate audience today. Feel free to unmute your cameras or your microphones if you want to ask a question, or feel free to type it into the chat if you prefer that as well.
Hey everyone, this is Danielle.
Hello.
Hi, thanks Catherine. This has been really interesting. Thanks so much for doing this. I have a question about something you said earlier. You talked about internal partnerships and you mentioned working with courier companies, for instance, to help prevent fraud, etc. So I think that's excellent advice for sure. And it prompted me to think about, do you think there is any value also in working with other teams or departments within your business? So outside of your immediate fraud team, and getting them to understand the types of fraud your business is seeing, how it is committed. You know, I find in my experience, the rest of the company, and I'm not blaming them, but they often don't really know what is going on. They just see the numbers and they think, oh gosh, fraud is costing me so much, you know. So I think there is value, and I would like to hear your view on this, on doing some education and, you know, maybe collaborate as well with other teams on prevention, because if you don't tell them what's going on, they can't actually help you. And quite often I find that people who've been in the business, even in other areas, they will have some valuable input as well.
Yeah, it's a great point, Danielle. And if I think back to when I worked at Tesco, for example, because e-commerce, I don't want to age myself now, but because e-commerce itself was quite young at the time, I think it was fair to say we were all on a bit of a learning journey. And exactly as you've just described, it was incredibly important that we all understood a little bit about each other's areas. So whether it was the logistics function of how do we get a parcel from the warehouse to the end customer and we get them the right parcel and things don't go missing in between. But the other team there are two other teams actually that I found incredibly important to build strong links with: customer service. And customer service's job for me is rightly about making sure that customers are happy and that as a business, we are providing them with the service they expected and the best experience. It's obviously really challenging when as a fraud team, you're coming along and saying, yeah, don't be so nice to that person because they're trying to take money off you. It's just so anti what customer service teams are used to. They feel really uncomfortable about it. And so we used to run fraud awareness sessions to kind of give people, here's the reality of what fraud looks like for us as a business, and tell them some of the true stories that were happening. And of course, you'd get the, my goodness, does this really happen? But it got people thinking, well, okay, maybe I do need to just have that element of doubt, but not to such an extent that I'm doubting everybody that I'm speaking to. And over time that evolved, and we had an email address. If people just had that seed of doubt, that they shared order details with us that we could have a bit more of a look at. And over time that really built up, and you know, that whole storytelling and you know, sharing the reality of what our world looked like with that team became really valuable. The other team was the marketing team, because they definitely saw the fraud team as the anti-sales team.
Yes, I was just going to mention marketing as well.
So we should sit at opposite ends of the building because we were both trying to achieve completely different things. But for me, the aha moment with that team was they came to me one day and they said, our sales are 10 times higher than they usually are in a day. It's like, okay, we think it might be fraud. And sure enough, it was. There was one customer who had ordered a ridiculous number of log cabins, which log cabins aren't cheap. So yes, it did look very strange from a sales number perspective. But then helping them to work that through so that they weren't having to pay referral partners huge fees that they would have done, and seeing that actually working in partnership did benefit them to understand the relationships with providers they were using, how they were pushing marketing activities out to different customers. it almost kind of took that bad event to happen to really get them to notice. So I guess, again, you could argue it was storytelling and, well, this is what's in it for you and how we can help you. It's working out where those opportunities are to partner and bring benefits and understand what different parts of the business their objectives are, and therefore how, as a fraud or a payments team, you can link in with those objectives to get that engagement.
I agree. Thanks so much, Catherine.
No problem.
Are there any other questions? No?
I think I'm going to be let off lightly.
Yes. I do have one question if no one else does, if you don't mind. Fraud tools. Do you have any perspectives on what to look for in a partner or a vendor or a tool? Because to your point earlier, you know, it's a combination of automation and people, right? But at the same time too, you need something to help you monitor things as much as possible for you, so you don't have to do all the work yourself. How can companies think about what's important? It's rules, yes, but what should they be looking for when they're looking for a partner?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer simply,
Yeah.
Regina, because it really does depend. And it depends on the industry you're in, the geography you operate in, what's your business appetite to risk, what resources do you have internally? So let me go a little bit deeper into this one. So if you're a small business, you're probably not going to want to invest in people to support providers or run any process yourself. For a lot of small businesses, they'll rely on whatever provider is associated with their payment processor, and they keep it very simple.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're a larger business and you're looking to maybe focus on a few specific risks, or there are particular areas that you know are a challenge for you, it's about really quizzing the providers as to, well, how can you demonstrate to me that you really understand the challenges I'm facing and what can you do about it?
Yeah.
And building up an ROI, so knowing how big your problem is, and not just thinking about today, but thinking 1, 2, 3 years into the future, knowing how your business is growing or expanding and changing. What is it that's going to be important to you? And to your point on how much you automate, that makes a really big difference as well. So in the fraud world, there are some vendors who tend to focus more on, we'll give you liability shift. You don't need an army of people to support the fraud process, because if it's a problem, then we'll deal with it. Some people have the view that, well, if you're doing that, then aren't you just going to turn away a lot of genuine customers to make sure that the fraud risk doesn't become too much of an issue?
Right.
And so getting that balance between the impact it has on your revenue as well as managing the risk of fraud becomes incredibly important in that scenario. And knowing what makes sense to your business. Some businesses are really restricted on the headcount they can hire and almost forced to go down that full automation route.
Right.
It might be, though, that you don't stay in that path, and so you do continually, when I say continually, maybe every 2 or 3 years, just go back and revisit, is what I have still fit for purpose? Does it still deliver what I need it to and my current business needs, or are there new players in the market? Because certainly when I first started, there were maybe 4 or 5 providers. That's definitely gone up tenfold, if not more now. And so there is plenty of choice out there, and it's really making sure you as a business know what are the things that are important to you, and really challenge the providers you talk to as to whether they can support you with those challenges.
That's great. So sounds like we need to be interviewing the providers a fair bit and asking questions about what they know about the industry that our company is in, right? And just to make sure they really understand, the challenges that we face.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Are there any other questions?
Hey, this is Danielle again. Sorry.
No, all good.
just to add to what you just said, Catherine, I think there's also value in if you are new to this and you're worried about finding the right provider, and they obviously will all tell you they're the best in the business. There is value in networking, and there's value in asking your peers and and finding out what's worked and what hasn't worked for other people, as well in the industry, and who have gone through the same thing. Maybe your competitor won't talk to you, but fraud is fraud. So you can just, I think there's some real value to finding people that will be happy to talk about their experiences with vendors and how they tackled certain fraud problems, etc. What do you think?
Absolutely, that's certainly what got me through my early days, and this is the challenge I'm facing, because someone described it to me actually. Working in either the fraud or the payment space within merchants can be incredibly lonely, because you've got no one else within the business to go and talk to about what would I expect to happen in that situation. And so building up that network of people that maybe haven't been through the exact experience that you are, but can say, well, actually that's similar to some other situation, and kind of similar to what I was describing from a diversity and inclusion perspective, finding someone who can then connect you with someone who's maybe been through something similar or has had experience with that provider. Of course, it's invaluable, because then you're not relying on the salesperson who's giving their perspective on their organisation. You're getting something that's a little bit more independent. Yes, absolutely spot on.
Great. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Just one.
Yes, absolutely.
Because Catherine spoke of this buy now, pay later industry. So what I've observed is that here in India, there were a lot of buy now, pay later industries that came up, but a lot of them did not have the authority to affect your CIBIL score. So basically the credit score. So they were not registered. Here we call it as an NBFC, non-banking financial corporation. So they don't lend out loans, but they can provide you credit services. So personal observation is that once they have this registration in the NBFC, the default rate or the fraud rate comes down, because people know that the credit score could get impacted.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really interesting point, Mohit, because I think that is one of the challenges that we face today. It's kind of falling in between what people have seen as credit in the past, whether it's so in the UK, buying from catalogues and getting credit that way used to be really popular. That's kind of dropped away quite a lot now, and maybe people are more into whether it's payday loans or instant loans. But you're right, by not having this impact on credit scores, and there isn't a consequence from a consumer perspective of not paying, I think that is one of the challenges at the moment as to why bad debt, rather than true fraud, which has been the focus of most of this, it's actually more of a bad debt issue, becomes more of a problem. And so then it's going to come down to country by country how that evolves and becomes, I guess that in itself becomes a form of regulation, right? If it's part of that process.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. It was a great session.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mohit.
And for those of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about buy now, pay later, EWPN, we hosted an event about this topic, actually, I believe in June, with a number of people from around Europe, many different countries, in fact, and where we talked about the trends and pros and cons and a number of other areas. So feel free to check that out. We're on YouTube. We're also, I think it's also posted on our website, but we can also announce that again. But so if there aren't any more questions, then I'd just love to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. And we really hope you enjoyed the Fireside chat. We'll share this video on social media, so definitely keep an eye out for it. And you can either rewatch it or share it with your community and your network. We do have quite a few more events planned for the next few months. So when you have a free moment, do check our website or follow us on social media, especially LinkedIn and Twitter for updates. And we hope to see you soon again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Regina.